Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mazen Shawosh, and I'm an assistant professor of Management Information Systems at the Information Systems and Operations Management at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, and I'll be the moderator for this panel discussion today. On behalf of the Middle East and North African chapter of the Association for Information Systems, the Saudi Association for Information Systems, and the Interdisciplinary Center of Finance and Digital Economy at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, I would like to welcome our panelists for today, Professor Liangfei Qiu and Professor Tawfiq Alashoor. Professor Liangfei Qiu is the PricewaterhouseCoopers Associate Professor of Information Systems and Operations Management at the Washington College of Business at the University of Florida. He holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include prediction markets, social networks, social media, healthcare analytics, sharing economy, and artificial intelligence and fintech. He is currently an associate editor for MENA-AIS quarterly journal, a senior editor for production and operations management, and an associate editor for the Decision Support Systems journal. In 2020, he won the Outstanding Reviewer of the Year award from MENA-AIS quarterly. Moreover, he received the Information Systems Society Sandy Slaughter Early Career Award and the Association for Information Systems Early Career Award in 2019. Professor Tawfiq Alashoor is an assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School, Department of Digitalization. Before joining Copenhagen, he was an assistant professor at the Information Systems and Operations Management Department at King Fahd University. He completed his postdoc program at the University of Notre Dame in the United States and obtained his PhD from Georgia State University. Dr. Alashoor main research focuses on privacy decision-making and cybersecurity, and he received a Best Paper Award at the International Conference on Information Systems 2015, and the Best Reviewer Award at the Academy of Management Organizational Communications and Information Systems Division in 2018. So we will start this panel discussion with few questions to our panelists. And after we finish these questions, we'll open the floor to our dear audience. If they have any questions, they can open the mic or can put their questions in the chat box. Now, for the first question for our panelists, and the first question gonna go to Liangfei. What is the role of the reviewer?
Thank you, Mason, for the introduction. It is my great honor to be here to share my experience. So I have a few slides, so let me share my slides. So can you see my slides?
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So before I talk about the first question, I want to share the resource, MSQ resource. So, I'm sorry. I think MSQ has a very nice resource for reviewer. So if you face any questions about reviewers, so the first thing you may want to do is you can click on this, you can click on the MSQ link and look at MSQ reviewer resource. They have very nice answers to many questions and also guidelines for the general reviews. And in addition, MSQ will hold the annual virtual reviewer development workshop in November to December 2021. So if any of you are is interested in it, you can register for it through this link. And you can also check the MSQ website. You can find that link, the reviewer development workshop. So the first question, what is the role for reviewers? I think we can think about the stakeholders. So we are reviewing for journal, for science, and for authors. In my perspective, there are two kind of roles or two important roles of reviewers. The first one is gatekeeper. We want to pick good papers, right? And the second one is we want to serve for authors. We want to help authors write good papers. It is my personal opinion that if we look at reviewers, the second role is more important. Basically, we want to help authors. We want to improve papers. We want to help authors write good papers. So we need to kind of, as a reviewer, we want to list the shortcomings and the strengths of this paper. So that is kind of important. We need to focus more on the facts. So what are the shortcomings? What are the strengths of this paper? And the first role, gatekeeper, in my perspective, like in my mind, it seems that it is more important for editors. So editors, they will see your report, they will see your reviewer report, and they will look at the facts. So there are some strengths, there are some shortcomings. So the editors will do the weighting process. So which one is more important and like which one is kind of less important. I think editors will do the weighting process. And as a reviewer, it is more important to list strengths and shortcomings and focus on the facts. On the one hand, reviewers, they want to, as a reviewer, we want to help authors to improve their paper. On the other hand, as a reviewer, we want to communicate important information with the editor so that editors will know some basic information about the paper, the key strengths and the key shortcomings of the paper. So that is, in my view, the role of reviewers.
Tawfiq, you want to add something?
Yes. Thanks, Mazen and the entire group for organizing this event. And I'm very happy, like Liangfei, to share my experience in the review process. To me, I think the main role of the reviewer, of course, this is what I'm going to add, is adding to what Liangfei just described or explained. I think the main role is to help, the reviewer is there to help assess the validity of research and quality of research. Well, this depends on the journal, but generally that's the role of the reviewer, is to assess the validity of that research, and then the quality that should depend on the journal that received the submission. Also, another role is to make sure that research is consistent with the journal's interest, and that's related to quality as well. So sometimes you would submit a paper to a journal, it's high quality, but it may still not be accepted just because the journal is not interested in publishing that kind of research. So even if it's quality and interest or preference are just different dimensions in here. Let's say a third role is to help authors enhance their research. So the reviewer is there not to kill papers, but rather to help the authors improve upon their submission. And finally, like what Liangfei said, just to keep science going, this is the only procedure we have in the scientific field, the peer review process. And without reviewers, science would need another procedure, I would say.
All right. So Tawfiq, you mentioned something about making sure that to ensure the validity and the quality of the papers. Can you elaborate on these 2 points? What do you mean by validity and quality in this case? Because as you know, like we have a lot of conferences and a lot of journals that have different qualities and different requirements for the publication. So how the reviewer assure that the quality that is required or the validity required by the journal, the conference, is satisfied in this case?
Well, that's a big question, right? But I think, to me, validity in this sense means, does this scientific work qualify to be published to the public? Because if it's not valid, and the validity entails so many, sub validities. But overall, does this scientific work qualify to be published to the public? And that's I would say at a higher level abstraction of what validity means. If we go down that ladder, we are probably talking about if it's an empirical paper, is the methodology used valid? Is the data, or was the data analyzed correctly? And do the inferences from those analyses have conclusion validity? Are they scientifically supported based on the methods? And if it's a conceptual piece, then we will assess the validity through some logic kind of validity. Does the flow of the logic work in a good way that leads us to believe in this, let's say, theoretical piece? The quality may pertain to also validity and quality now are overlapping, but also quality quality could be about the writing of the paper. It might not be about the method or the logic. It's about writing the paper, the format. That's related to quality, not necessarily science. Liangfei, maybe?
Yeah, I completely agree with Tawfiq. So in terms of the validity, we may look at, like, for example, we may look at whether the methodology is appropriate. Like in empirical papers, sometimes we focus on addressing endogeneity problems. If it is this paper takes a causal perspective, then it is very important to establish the causation. So we will look at how this paper address the endogeneity problem in their specific context. So here, context is very important because for every empirical paper, we can say that there is an endogeneity problem. But what is the problem in the author's kind of specific context? This is very important. And as a reviewer, we do not only need to point out there is an issue, we need to point out there are some potential solutions, how to alleviate those endogeneity issues in the author's specific context. I think that is more important. So I see there is a question from the audience. So does that mean we are giving the feedback to the authors when their research is rejected? So I think it goes back to my original point. We want to help authors. So it is very important to give very detailed feedback to the authors, even if you are rejecting this paper. Like, for example, if we think the method is not appropriate, or this paper claims that it established the causality or the causation, but it does not. We need to point out what is the specific issue in this paper, in the author's context. And more importantly, we want to give them some feedback, some guidance, what are potential approaches to alleviate this concern. There might be several approaches, you can list them, and the authors may choose one of them, or they may have their own approach, but it is important to give some guidance, like what are the potential ways to alleviate those concerns, either from the methodology point of view or from the data point of view. The authors, they may collect more data, or they may use an alternative empirical identification strategy.
Great, awesome. So basically, one of the main roles of the reviewers is basically to help the authors, structure their paper in a good way and make it ready for publication. And this takes us to the second question, which is basically how to write a constructive and a virtuous review for the co-authors of the manuscript. And Tawfiq, you can answer this question first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Is there another slide for that question?
Yeah.
Liangfei?
Yeah.
Then now I'll list my points, and then you take over.
Yeah.
I would suggest there is a paper, an editorial commentary by Arun Rai in 2019. The title of that was Developing Virtuous Reviewers. I can share the link later in here, but I think that is a very that editorial comment gives a thorough answer to this question. And I think that's what led me to write good reviews based on the feedback I received from editors. And to answer that question, my personal perspective is, first thing, as a reviewer, I always thank the authors for submitting their research. That's the first sentence to start with. They did effort, they did all of that, and they are interested in selling their product through us, the reviewers, the editors, the journal, that entire community. So it's worth it, and I believe they deserve to be thanked for that effort. Second thing, I'm sharing my template. I think here, this is my template. If the template question that you asked earlier, Mazen, before we started the panel, is as of concern in here. So first thing, I would thank the authors. Second thing, I would state my background and any necessary assumptions that I have, and that will help the authors to interpret my comments. So it's, if I don't believe, let's say if I don't believe in endogeneity as a big problem, I kind of put that as an assumption that I'm okay with this kind of or relaxing that assumption. If there I see the problem, but I'm okay with it. So that's an assumption that needs to be revealed to reviewers. Then interpret the submitted research. So I would add a summary of my understanding of that submission. So after I state my background, my assumptions, I would state a summary of the paper, because maybe I did not understand the paper as the authors intended. So adding that short summary, 4 or 5 lines, will help the authors, and also more importantly, the editors, follow my comments in case my understanding was not consistent with the intended purpose of that paper. And then I would state 2 or 3 major issues that should kill the paper. Of course, if any, maybe there are not issues. So only state 2 or 3 major issues that should kill the paper. Again, I'm emphasizing this, but I'm also emphasizing that there might not be these major issues. And I would elaborate on each issue in details. And the last thing, I would state all other things as minor issues, bullet points. And I would end that with a thank you note and wish the authors the best of luck. So the overall, if there is 1, 2, or 3 major issues, that's what the focus of the review should be. And I think that stating whether as a reviewer I reject or accept the paper is, at least to me and many people in the field, is not a recommended practice. The decision to reject or accept the paper is for the editors to make. The authors are just there to review the paper, to give recommendations, solutions, problems, and there is a box, right? So there is a dedicated box for the reviewers to go and click on it, and the editors make the decision. That would be my long answer to this question.
Awesome, great. Liangfei?
Yeah. Thank you, Tawfiq. I completely agree with your point. You give a very comprehensive structure of writing a constructive review. And actually, I think my template is very similar to yours. So I will not kind of repeat this, but I want to take a different perspective about writing constructive reviews. So recently, I read a book. The book's name is Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. So this book is written by a famous scientist, Kahneman. He is also a Nobel Prize winner. He has a very famous book previously, like Thinking Fast and Slow. I believe some of you have already read it. It's a very nice book. And when I read this Noise book, I feel it is a perfect framework for reviewers for how to write a kind of a constructive, a beautiful review. This book emphasizes that there are many errors in human judgment. So I'm thinking that writing a review is also kind of a human judgment. And as a reviewer, we also suffer from those human kind of judgment errors. So we need to realize those errors, then we can try to avoid them, or at least kind of alleviate them. So if we look at this book, there are 2 basic types of errors. One is bias, the other is noise. So bias is kind of a systematic error. So there are many like a human's cognitive biases. And in Kahneman's previous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he also listed a lot of human cognitive bias. Like in our review process, we also suffer from biases as a reviewer. For example, we all like catchy topics, like trending topics as a reviewer. If we look at some topics, for example, like AI, we tend to like it because it is a very important topic. It's a trending topic. It may create some kind of positive bias when we look at the title or the first paragraph of the paper. We tend to like it and we may ignore other shortcomings of this paper. So it may create some bias. It does not necessary to create it, but it may. So we need to kind of remind ourselves there might be some bias in the process. And the second type of kind of human judgment error is noise. So it is related to personal taste. In our context as a reviewer, so everyone has kind of personal taste, right? We may favor a particular method or a particular writing style. We have different backgrounds, so we have our personal taste. And a very important conclusion of this book is that aggregation cannot reduce bias, but it may reduce noise. So if we look at different people, if we aggregate their opinions, we may be closer to the truth in terms of reducing noise. That's why in the review process, typically we want to have 3 reviewers, 2 reviewers. We want to aggregate their opinions. So editors, they can reduce noise. They can look at different reviewers' opinions. Some reviewers, they may have expertise on methodology. Some reviewers, they may have expertise on the topic or on the theory. And then we can aggregate their opinions. So in terms of how to writing a constructive reviews, I want to talk about some kind of basic points. The first point, as Tawfiq has emphasized, so reviewers, we just propose our opinions and let the editors do the kind of the decision process, decide whether to accept the paper, reject the paper. So the more important role for reviewers, we want to focus on the facts and we want to focus less on the sentiment. It's kind of sometimes the reviewers, they may talk a lot about their sentiment. They don't like the paper. I believe it is more important to list the facts. And for the sentiment, we can leave it to the later process. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to focus on the strengths and shortcomings, let editors do the job of weighting. And in particular, we want to focus on how to improve the paper. And we need to look at the context very carefully. As I mentioned earlier, if it is an endogeneity problem, we need to talk about what is the specific endogeneity problem. And we also need to offer some approach to alleviate this concern. So it's kind of, as an editor, sometimes I read a reviewer's report. They are talking about different kind of shortcomings of this paper, but they do not go to the author's context. So what they are talking about is that kind of the general shortcomings you can find from a textbook. So this paper suffers a severe problem from endogeneity. But what is the kind of endogeneity problem in this context? In the author's paper, the reviewer does not kind of explicitly point it out. So it is very difficult for the authors to realize what is the true question or what is the important concern in their paper. I think we need to go to the details. We need to talk about the context. We are not offering the textbook solutions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, like the very general shortcomings. We need to go to the author's context. From that context, we can kind of spot the real problem, the real issues. And we also want to differentiate between major comments and minor comments in terms of the structure of your reviews. So some of them, so you want to let the authors know which ones are more important, which ones kind of less important. So our purpose, as I mentioned, emphasized many times, our purpose is to help authors so that we need to make our reviews crystal clear to the reviewers, which ones are very important. the last point is that we need to realize that authors, they may have different perspectives and backgrounds. So there is an old story. So a tiger looks at an eagle, like catches a prey, and the tiger thinks that the eagle's approach is not efficient. But that is from a tiger's perspective, right? For the eagle, it might be an efficient approach. So as a reviewer, we may have a very different background from the authors. We have different kind of trainings. Maybe we have kind of different kind of academic taste. So we need to realize that we are very different from the authors. And sometimes we need to think from the author's perspective. So which is an efficient approach, which is the kind of appropriate approach for the authors. And if we go back to our my previous kind of framework of human judgment errors, like if we want to avoid this kind of biases and noises, let me give some examples. So if we look at a paper and you like this paper very much, or you hate this paper very much, then you may ask yourself, is it a bias? So we know that we have the first impression bias. When we look at the abstract of the paper, when we look at the title of the paper, so we may like this paper very much. Then we ignore the shortcomings of the paper. And the opposite may also be true. When we look at the title and the abstract, we hate this paper. And then we don't even try to look at the kind of the strengths of this paper. We don't look at this paper carefully. So that is the first impression bias. So it is kind of extensively studied in many different contexts, but I believe in the reviewer's context, it may also be true. So we have to kind of realize that we need to kind of remind ourselves, do we kind of have this first impression bias? And also in the noise book, Kahneman talks about two types of noises. One is the level noise, the other is pattern noise. So in our reviewer's context, level noise means that some reviewers, they may be more lenient in their nature or the opposite. So as an associate editor, so I know that some reviewers, they are more lenient. And I have some reviewers, they always recommend a major revision. So I ask them to write reviews for many times. I haven't seen any, even at one time, they write a rejection. So every time they write a kind of major revision. But that's kind of okay. We need to focus on the content of their writing, right? As I mentioned earlier, like reviewers, the most important thing is not their recommendation, it's the content of their writing. So what are the facts? So what are the strengths? What are the shortcomings? And the second type of noise, we call it pattern noise. It means that reviewers can be more lenient to particular type of paper, to particular topics, or due to special occasions. So we know that some reviewers, actually, if we look at some empirical evidence, like some professionals like judges or like doctors, they may suffer from pattern noise. So they may make different decisions. They may make bad decisions when their mood is bad, when they are hungry, when they are tired. So reviewers, we are also human beings. We may also suffer from very similar problems. If doctors, if judges, they are professional people, they may suffer from those mistakes. So as a reviewer, we are also kind of professional people, I think. And in the same way, we may also suffer similar problems. So our decisions may be affected by our mood. For example, you just receive a rejection or you just receive like acceptance. When you write a review, I think sometimes it may affect how you write the review, at least the sentiment of the review. So we should kind of remind ourselves about it. Thank you. So awesome. This is my answer to this question.
Awesome, awesome. Great advice from you, Liangfei and Tawfiq. So I think it's like one of the first steps that a reviewer should basically follow is that being aware of the biases that he or she might carry when it comes to reviewing the paper and stating the assumptions and the backgrounds of the reviewer might help make this explicit to the mind of the reviewer when it comes to reviewing the paper. And this actually takes me to the next question, which is basically what kind of pitfalls and bad practices that a reviewer should avoid? Since we talked about how to write a constructive and a virtuous review, what are the things that a reviewer should avoid when writing a review for a manuscript, either in a conference or in a journal? And Liangfei can take this question first.
Yeah, thank you. So the pitfalls and the bad practices a reviewer should avoid. So I will go back to my framework of noise. So if we realize the existence of bias and noise, so we want to avoid those things. They are pitfalls, they are bad practices. So we should, for example, when we talk about the patent noise, we just talk about it. We know that judges and doctors, they may make bad decisions. Reviewers, they may also make bad decisions when their mood is not very good. They may kind of affect their decisions may be affected by the outside factors. So how to avoid or how to alleviate those kind of concerns? So I have some simple ways to alleviate this problem. So the first thing, of course, you have to realize you have the tendency to make a bias or a noisy decision. So you need to realize that you need to realize the existence of bias and noise. Then you can kind of try to find out ways to avoid or alleviate those concerns. So the second thing is that in review reports, try to state concrete points rather than general sentiments or general things, because very general things, they are easily affected by your mood. Like this paper is very nice paper, this paper is a very bad paper, like those kind of general sentiments. So of course you can mention some of it, but don't focus on it. Those general things are easily be affected by your mood. So you want to state facts, some concrete points. For the concrete points, they can be affected by your mood, but they are less affected by your mood. So try to focus more on the concrete points. So that is one way to alleviate this problem. And third, you can try to do reviews when you are not tired, when you have kind of time. So my personal experience is that I try to do reviews on Saturday morning, because at that time I'm not tired, and on Saturday it's unlikely you receive acceptance or rejection decisions. Typically you receive those decisions on weekdays. So in that sense, you are less likely to be affected by your mood, by some outside factors, simply because like on a Saturday morning, so outside things, they are less likely to be going on. Right, so you can focus more on your review process, and you are not tired and you are not hungry, and those things, they will not affect your review quality. So that is some of my simple kind of solution or suggestions to alleviate this problem. May not completely solve this problem, but it may alleviate the problem.
Yeah. So basically, don't be hungry when you review a paper.
Yeah, and so there is a lot of empirical evidence showing that judges, they make bad decisions when they are hungry, like in the middle of kind of at noon, very close to the noon, they are making a very bad decision. I think if judges, they made this kind of bad decisions, reviewers, they may also make bad decisions.
All right, awesome. Tawfiq?
Thanks, Liangfei. I agree, and I also remember one of the studies on judgments. The judges, when they were given the task at the end of the day because they were tired, they tended to make worse or not as good decisions as they would do in the morning. So I think that's a very important issue that reviewers need to be aware of when they review papers. Sometimes I review papers and I can feel that I'm extremely tired, so I just should stop reviewing and come to the paper another day. And that creates another problem, because when you read a chunk of the paper and then you stop and you come back later, you lose memory, and therefore you might make even worse decisions. So the best way is to block a few hours and just work constantly on that paper, because you don't have a big incentive to work on that review thing for a few days. You just want to get it done and then leave it. So I would say, Block, don't do this. Don't make any intermission while reviewing a paper. And as Liangfei said, be cognitively prepared and also emotionally prepared. And with regard to like saying sentiments like this is a nice paper or this is a bad paper, I think, yeah, they don't make sense, but unless you elaborate on them, right? So if the paper is bad, well, of course, you don't say the paper is bad. You put it in a constructive way, but then you elaborate more. I heard some people at, I think I was at a MICE quarterly reviewer workshop a few years ago, and that came up, like, don't never say this is a sweet paper, I like it. It adds nothing to the rational decision making process. So there are pitfalls, as I said earlier. The decision, at least to me, there's a box for it. Don't state your decision in the review packet. Select the decision, the editors will make the decision. The role of the reviewer is to review the work. Don't be rude in your critique. There's always ways to frame things in a positive way. Kahneman's work and Tversky can help so much. So if you know anything about that work, you know how significant the effect of framing is. So when you can always switch the frame of any sentence. So try to always use a positive frame when you criticize or when you review these papers. Next thing is never criticize a thing in the paper without explaining the logic behind your critique. So you cannot just say, "Oh, this is a survey study. I don't like it." Well, that depends on the assumption of the reviewer that they don't like survey studies. They don't help with causality issues like endogeneity. These papers there's always endogeneity problem. I think when I remember this from someone, the only non-endogenous thing is God, because every study has some endogeneity problem. Unless, depending on the research design, you can improve that endogeneity issue. But the point is, always have an explanation for why you do not agree with a certain thing in the paper. Another thing which relates to, I think, Kahneman's work too, confirmation bias. Do not fall prey to the confirmation bias that all of the studies that you published are related to that paper that you're reviewing. And then you throw a number of citations from your studies. There's always, we try, because we have this confirmation. Of course, you review once you reach, I'm young in the field, but I'm sure Liangfei can add to this. By the time, like in 10, 15 years from now, all the papers I'll receive are within my certain area. So I know I'm going to be feeling that it's a feeling again, see how emotion affects these decisions. Oh, this paper relates to my research. Well, why don't you cite my paper? I think this is just a confirmation bias. So we should be aware of it. And it's very hard to actually be neutral, because this is what you do. And you're reviewing work that is trying to add to the conversation that you've been in for many years. Last thing is never miss a deadline. Block a few hours, put it in your calendar, and stick to the plan. That's one of the pitfalls. Like that's why the review process takes too long, because reviewers would put that in their calendar, but they might not stick with it. So I think a good practice is that's it. You put it in your calendar and work on it. 3 hours, 4 hours, and you're done. Unless you needed more time, you can add more time. Because reviewing a paper, again, the incentive is not that high, but across time, you will see as a junior faculty or a PhD student that this actually, the return on investment from the reviewing work comes later after several years. And I think Liangfei can add to this, since I'm just starting my career.
Yes, so let me connect this question with the first question, which is about the role of the reviewer. So basically, I'm borrowing this actually from the podcast by Jan Ricker and Nick Berenti, which is called This IS Research. And I believe they had one episode about reviewing and reviewers, and they talked about something called developmental reviewing, which is, if I'm not mistaken, you can go back to the podcast to correct me, but the idea is that it's like the reviewer is involving himself or herself in the paper and trying to push the paper into a different direction other than the author's direction. Is this something that the reviewers should avoid when they do the review, and what they should do basically in this case? Liangfei, you can go if you want.
Okay, yeah. So I think that part is, the question is very interesting. And like, as I mentioned earlier, like we have different approaches. Reviewers and authors, they may have different backgrounds. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a tiger and eagle story, right? So when you talk about how to solve a problem, how to kind of improve the paper, like from your perspective, you have to realize that it is from your own perspective, from the like a reviewer's perspective. But on the other hand, you want to leave some room to the reviewers. They may have their own kind of creativity, and they may be ego. They have their ego perspective, right? You from the tiger's perspective, it may be both of you may be correct, just from different perspectives. So you may want to leave some room to the reviewers. You have some suggestions, but typically when I'm a reviewer, I will kind of say something like, I also leave some rooms to the reviewers. They can also do something like a creativity, like as long as they can address this concern, it's okay if the reviewers can like from their own approach. I think that is okay. So on the one hand, you are offering some suggestions, but you need to remember that like as a reviewer, these are suggestions, right? And reviewers, authors, they may have their own approach. So as long as their approach are okay, you need to leave some rooms to the reviewers. That is my perspective.
Awesome, great. All right, so this actually takes us to the next question, which is Tawfiq, you can answer first, which is basically, so when a reviewer receives an invitation to review a paper, what should they do and not do basically when they are approached with a review request?
Okay, you hear me, right?
Yes.
I think I have a shorter laundry list for this one. I would say you should not ignore the invitation. That's the first thing. Even if it was from a journal that is completely irrelevant to your work, even if it sounded suspicious, just spam. Respond to that email and make a decision, accept or reject after thinking about what you want to decide. Because from an editorial perspective, you send an email, it's making that decision should not take much time, right? Whether I want to review it or not, you scan the paper, read the abstract, and then you should be able to assess whether or not you can decide. So that making that decision does not take more than 5-10 minutes. So I think it's important if you put yourself in the editor's shoes, you want everyone to respond right away once they see the email, at least within 1 day, unless they're on a vacation. So I think it's a very respectful way to respond to that email as soon as you can, because the editors are making effort. And also authors are waiting, the whole review process, the timeline of that. Second thing, only accept if you believe you have the skills to review that submission. In terms of methodology, topic, etc., however, at least as a PhD student, I think it's, you will get yourself into things that you don't have strong background in, but you will receive these review requests most likely from conferences. And my personal opinion is that it's okay. Just go. This is how you learn. Review some papers that are slightly relevant to your topic, or from a colleague who wanted help with a reviewer. Go and try and see how it goes. But for a journal submission, especially a top tier journal, most likely you won't receive a review request unless you have evidence to the editors that you qualify to review for these papers. And last, thank the editors for inviting you, because that shows that the editors believe in your work. So every time you submit a review or you accept a review, thank the editors and do the best you can. That would be my laundry list for this one.
Great, thank you, Tawfiq. Liangfei?
Yeah, so I saw a question from the audience. Does the title and the introduction of paper give the reviewer first impression for rejecting or accepting the paper? I think in practice, the answer is probably that is true. Like, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, like we suffer from first impression bias. Reviewers, they suffer from those kind of first impression bias. If we think about practice, when reviewers, they look at the introduction, the first several paragraphs, the first several pages, they may have a first impression, and this first impression is pretty important, and it may affect how this reviewer writes his or her report later. So, I mean, from the author's point of view, I want to emphasize that as an author, we have to improve our title, the introduction part. This is very important. And from a reviewer perspective, I want to remind every kind of reviewer, we have to realize we may have this first impression bias. We should try to avoid them. Like, we need to look at the whole paper. So it's kind of, after you read the whole paper, then you make some kind of judgment. So before you look at the whole paper, you just list some bullet points, some concrete things. I think that will help reviewers. So when I look at a paper, don't first make your kind of judgment whether you want to reject paper or accept the paper. So you look at some points. So you look at the introduction. What is a good thing in the introduction? Is the research question important? And then you look at the methodology. You look at the data. Like, you have some points. After that, you write the points in your paper. Then after you finishing looking at the paper, you look at all these points. At that time, you can make a better decision, kind of like what is kind of your recommendation if you want to recommend. So it's kind of, you need to first make all the points, to look at the concrete points first, and then you can make a judgment if you want to do recommendation. That is kind of my suggestion. And I want to add one more point into the last question, like the pitfalls. So sometimes I know that I communicated with some reviewers. Some reviewers, they tend to write very long reviews, like single space, like 10 pages. I have seen this kind of 10 pages, like more than 10 pages. So sometimes if we look at the review document, it's even longer than the author's original paper. So that sometimes it happens. Like, there are different reasons. One reason is that like reviewers, they want to kind of have a signal to the editors. They are diligent and they are knowledgeable. So they write very long reviews. So whether we want to write a long review, I think it depends. So the most important thing is that you have to the point. You have to be focused. You focus on the most important questions and to the point. Don't waste a lot of paragraphs discussing some minor issues. But if you really need to elaborate on your points, then you can write a long review. For example, you want the authors to completely understand your point. Sometimes some points are kind of not easy to be understand. It's kind of, some points are nuanced. You need several paragraphs to elaborate on your points. In that case, So you can write like a longer review because, so once again, goes back to my previous point, the role of reviewers is to help authors. If you want the authors to completely understand your point, you need to write a long review. So that is fine. So I'm completely agree with that. If you want to let authors understand your point, so you have to write a longer paragraph, a longer review. So that is okay, I think. Let's go back to the current question. So what should I do and not do when I receive a review invitation? So from my perspective, I mean, I completely agree with Tawfiq. Like, it is very important to respond kind of within a day if you are not in a vacation, because kind of review editors, if you like, sometimes if you don't have time, so the editors, they need to find other reviewers. So it will facilitate a smooth the process. And as a reviewer, we can also ask ourselves two questions. The first question, is the paper in my domain, kind of either in methodology or topic or theory? And secondly, can I finish the review before the deadline? So sometimes we may need to kindly decline the review because of two issues. One is fitness issue. So typically, I don't know anything about the paper, especially the methodology part. If I don't know the methodology well, kind of, it's out of my expertise sometimes. So we may need to decline the review. And the second thing is the capacity issues. Like, I already have several kind of commitments, review commitments. It's unlikely I can finish the review before the deadline. So it's very important to finish your review before the deadline. I think if you accept the request, then it means that you think there are, I think, 95 or 99% of probability you can finish the review before the deadline. So once you accept the request, I think you need to be confident that you can finish the review before the deadline. So that is kind of pretty important in my perspective.
All right, awesome. So this takes us to our last question before we open the floor to the audience to ask questions. That, okay, you have received the review request, you have agreed to do the review for the manuscript. So what best strategies to follow to ensure submitting the review without any delays? Liangfei can go first if you want.
Okay, yes. So I think from my experience as a reviewer, when I accept a review request, I immediately set a calendar reminder 2 weeks before the deadline. I think at least 2 weeks, you need to start early. And there is another cognitive bias mentioned by Kahneman and his colleagues. People are typically overconfident about their ability to finish a project before the deadline. That also applies to reviewers. Sometimes, as an author or as a reviewer, we are overconfident about our ability to finish our projects, to finish our reviews before the deadline. We have to kind of start early, I think at least 2 weeks, because I try to finish the review. I mean, that's my personal experience. I try to finish the review on Saturday or on weekend. So at least 2 weeks before that, it would be good, because sometimes like it's not always like available on Saturday. So it's 2 weeks, you make sure that you have time to finish the review. That is pretty important, I think. Start early. If you start late, then you have the overconfidence issues, and you will get to be delayed. And the second thing is that sometimes you may need extension because something happened. So that is understandable. And I think you have to email editors and specify the time you need, because like I know that we may have some unexpected things may happen. So that is understandable. If you need an extension, then just email editors and specify the time you need. Try to kind of like, if I need like 1 more week or 2 more weeks, so that's kind of okay, but try to stick to that time frame, no more than like 1 or 2 more weeks. I think that is kind of okay, like if we need an extension. Yeah.
Brilliant. Tawfiq?
I don't think I can add much here. Thanks, Liangfei. The point is, I do the same thing. So when I receive a request that I accept it, I would put it 2 weeks or so before the deadline, because I know I'm gonna push it a little more. Like if that Saturday or Friday or Sunday I couldn't finish the review, I know I would push it more. But I would stick to, if I pushed it more, I would stick to the to plan B, that I must finish it at least a week or a few days before the deadline. Sometimes things happen, and I've had experience where I asked the editor to give me 1 or 2 days after the deadline, and editors they welcome this, because you give them a heads up, and then therefore they can plan their schedule as well. Yeah, I think that's all what I can add to this question.
All right, awesome. So now you can ask any questions in the chat box, or if you'd like to open the mic and ask the questions, by all means, just raise your hand and ask the question. But until people raise their hand, we have a question like in the chat box saying that what's the major issues our paper rejected based on reviewers' perception? Because sometimes you already put much effort on working on it, but still rejected. So it's like, if I understand the question correctly, it's like, for example, me and my co-authors put our best in writing the manuscript before submitting it, but still it gets rejected. It's like the question is like, why? What is going on here in this case? You can go, Liangfei, if you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think kind of rejection is pretty normal. Like for us, we always receive, I mean, in many times, like it's a high probability we will receive rejections when we like submitting papers. Like there are several reasons. Like when we look at the reviews, we want to see like what is the exact reason. So sometimes like when we look at a very new research question, like it's kind of too new and people do not appreciate this kind of question that is possible. One reason. The second reason is that when we look at kind of a well-established question, although we think our kind of perspective is still pretty new, but reviewers and editors, they think the contribution, the marginal contribution is not sufficient, because it is a crowded area, right? So there are many papers in previous studies in it. So although your paper or my paper is like a little bit, a bit different from another perspective, but the difference is not sufficient, or the marginal contribution is not sufficient. And more importantly, maybe from the previous literature, we can kind of infer the results from your study, right? Like even if we don't know the results from your study, like, but somehow from the previous study, we can infer the results of your study, like your results are not that surprising. And like from the literature, we can already have a pretty good understanding of the phenomenon you are investigating. So that may be one possible reason. And the last possible reason is could be like the methodology issues. Sometimes, although you ask a very good question, you have a very nice data set. The methodology, like if you want to establish causality, if you want to do prediction, and so the methodology may suffer from some kind of problems. Reviewers, they may ask you to establish the causal relationship, but in your approach, you try to alleviate the endogeneity concerns, the causation concerns. But sometimes the reviewers and editors think that they are not enough. They are not sufficient. You need to do more. So all those reasons can lead to a rejection. Like I think every author like kind of experience a lot of rejections. Like when you submit more papers, you will receive more rejections. That I think like receiving rejections is not a bad thing. If you are receiving a lot of rejections, it means that you are writing a lot of papers. I think that it means that your product productivity is pretty good. I think that actually might be a good sign. So the good thing is that you need to learn from your rejections. That is the most important thing. When you get some rejections, you need to look at the review report. Of course, you may not agree with like every point. Some points you may not agree with them, but that's fine. But you want to learn something from the review reports. Sometimes you may see like a first impression bias, right? So we know that reviewers should not have first impression bias, but in practice, there might be first impression bias. And as an author, we try to improve our introduction part, the title part a lot, right? To avoid kind of first impression bias from the reviewers. So that is also one thing the authors can do. Like when you look at the review, like try to learn something from it, because like you submit a paper to one journal, you get some reviews. And if you do not take any actions, you submit this paper to another journal, it's likely that you will get similar reviews or similar kind of feedback. You have to kind of improve your paper and like either in the writing style or in the methodology or in some other things. And then you have a higher chance to getting into another journal. So that is my perspective.
Great. Tawfiq, do you have anything to add?
I completely agree with Liangfei's points. Just one advice that I would like to share. I received that advice a couple of years, 3 years ago or so. When I first received my first rejection from MENA-AIS quarterly, I was completely devastated, right? So that's your first try in a top journal. And I remember talking to Arun Wright the day after, saw me like very sad, like what's happening? And then I told him I got rejected by this journal. And then he told me this advice that I still remember and I always embrace, which is the publication journey is like you're learning how to swim. So when you start swimming, you drown the first time, second time, third time. And this is one of the most, I would say, ruthless swimming lessons. So you just throw yourself, you get rejected, try again, try again, try again. And then you will learn how to swim in that context, which means publish. So you will learn how to publish after getting rejected. If you're lucky, you get accepted in the first few times. If not, that's the, I would say, the pattern. The normal path is you get rejected several times and then you learn how the game works.
Awesome. I believe we have room for 2 more questions. I mean, since we don't have any questions here, but I do actually have questions that were prepared from the previously. Let's take Mona's actually question. So from the point of view of each panelist, what is the first thing that catches your eye in the paper presented to you? Is it true that the presence of graphs and pie charts in the paper increases the chances of acceptance? You can go, Liangfei, if you want.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a nice question. I think the first thing catches my eye is the research question, like because when I first look at a paper, I want to look at what are the research questions. Are they very important research questions? Like that is the most important thing. So like as an author, like I typically write a research question, highlight those research questions, right? When the reviewer, they first go through the introduction part, they need to understand what are your key research questions. You have to frame your research question pretty well. Then the reviewer will understand what are your research questions and why your research questions are important and why those kind of questions, the answer to the questions are not kind of obvious, are not, it's not like studied in previous literature. So that is kind of more important to me. And the second part of this question is it's true that the presence of graphs and pie charts in the paper increases the chance of acceptance. I think it depends, and typically the answer, I would say no. Because when I look at a paper, I mean, that is my personal opinion. From my experience, when I look at the graphs. So I will look at those very relevant graphs. For example, if we want to talk about the relationship between A and B, then I want to focus, is there some like model-free evidence to show that A and B are correlated kind of things. So this kind of graphs are very important. So if your graphs are not conveying that information, then I think the answer is no, it does not increase the chance. I want to look at some important like information, important graphs. If your graphs can convey some like model-free information, of course, in your estimation techniques, you will have a more kind of scientific or more rigorous examination of this question. But before you do that, we do want to see some model-free evidence, like we look at some graphs. Indeed, there is some correlation between those variables. I think that is important. That is kind of the first step. We explore our data set, do some data kind of description. We find this pattern. So those kind of graphs, I believe they are very important. They are informative.
Tawfiq?
Thanks, Liangfei. I can add to this. So to the second part of the question, it's a no for me. Personally, graphs or charts don't matter. I think the first impression I get when I first read the introduction, like Liangfei said, the research question, what the authors did, because they foreshadow like the method and results in the introduction. So you kind of get a sense of where this paper is going. I've had experiences where the introduction reads amazing and also the literature review. And then when you get to the method, you see so many flaws in the paper. And my, from an abstract point of view or memory recency effect, I would, my recommendation if it was a reject, but the paper is well written. And there is some good idea in there, or even more than just one idea. I would, if I decided to recommend a reject, I would tell the editors that I'm happy to review another version of this paper if the review panel decided to give it a chance. Even though I gave it a reject, I'm okay relaxing my assumption if the editors and the entire review team decided to give a chance to that article. So, and overall, it's the introduction. That's what gives me the first impression on a paper. But I will still go and review the entire thing.
All right, great. I believe we're going to have this question as our last question. I know that, I mean, the questions will be coming, but I mean, you can ask our dear panelists even after we finish our event for today, because again, we are a community. We help and support each other. So it's not like this is going to be the last event for which your answer is going to be answered. But anyhow, it's for the sake of time. So
yeah, I mean, just send us an email so we can answer the questions if you have more questions after the panel. So we would be happy to share the experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Liam. Thank you for the sake of my Tawfiq. Okay, the last question. Can the reviewer choose which parts or part of the paper he or she will review based on their expertise instead of rejecting the entire review invitation or providing insincere feedback? And can the author suggest some reviewers based on their expertise related to the paper under review? You can go ahead, Tawfiq, if you want first.
Oh, sure. Thanks. That's a very good question. And I've had experiences where I, for instance, didn't know much about the methodology of the paper, let's say the statistical part. But the topic is core to what I do. And the editors sent me an invitation, so I liked the paper maybe, but I'm less knowledgeable about the statistical, let's say modeling. I'm not into modeling, so I don't get that part. But then I would, before I accept, I would ask the editor that I would thank them, and then I'll inform them that I'm more than happy to review this, but just a heads up, I am not knowledgeable about the statistical part that was done. If you are okay with that, I'll do it. If not, I think it's better to find someone else to review that work. And I would, if the answer was no, and the editor asked for some suggestions, I would try to provide a suggestion, or even in that same email, I would provide suggestions for people who could review that work. And there are editors who would be fine. They normally recruit someone who knows the method and someone who knows the theory, someone who could give an overarching view on the paper, and then they balance that out. That's why it's important not to state the decision within your review packet in the comments. They make the decision. That would be my answer.
Awesome. Liangfei?
Thank you, Tawfiq. I agree with you. Yeah. So like, for example, a paper may have like different components, analytical modeling, empirical method, and something else. Like, I think it is okay for a reviewer just from his own perspective and own expertise, as long as he or she communicates with the editor. I think it is very important in your review report. You mentioned that like you are more familiar with, for example, analytical modeling, or you are more familiar with empirical methodology, econometrics, and so on. So you are from that perspective, and you are mainly evaluate that type of methodology in the paper. As long as you made that clear, I think it is perfectly fine. And as Tawfiq mentioned, like editors, they typically like choose different reviewers from different backgrounds. One is expert in modeling, the other is expert in empirical methodology, and so on. So they want to get a kind of a complete view, and each reviewer, they may just evaluate one particular methodology. I think that is perfectly fine. And it is also pretty common, like, in that. And the second part of the question can also suggest some reviewers based on their expertise. I think the answer is yes, and most journals, they allow the authors to nominate reviewers because the authors, they are more familiar with their paper and they have better knowledge about which reviewers they are more likely to kind of like have the expertise to evaluate the paper. And I believe most IS journals, they allow reviewers to nominate their reviewers. Yeah.
Awesome. Tawfiq, do you have anything to add?
Sorry, I forgot to answer the second part, but Liangfei did that. And yeah, you all normally suggest nominate reviewers and editors before you submit the first manuscript. I wanted to mention the other thing, which is even communicating that to the editor that you're not quite familiar with a certain part of the paper. It's also important to communicate that to the authors. So in the review, those are the assumptions and backgrounds we talked about earlier when we started. So let the authors know that you did not assess this part because it's not under your expertise. So they know now they're more able to, or they're able to interpret your review packet more accurately or less unaccurately or inaccurately. Once they know that you are not able to assess that part of the article.
All right, awesome. All right, by this question, we have reached the end of our event for today. But if our panelists would like to give a final advice in 280 characters, just like a tweet, what would be this advice? You can go, Liangfei, first.
I think the best advice is you do need to realize the existence of bias and noise in the review process. You try to avoid those things. And I saw a very good message from the audience, like a quick note to add. Try not to submit the review straight away. Give it a day or two and read them once again. Yes, that is a very good suggestion. That is also what I did. I didn't got a chance to talk about it like in the previous answers. So that is a very good suggestion. And why we want to do that? Because we are kind of affected by the noise, right? We are talking about occasion noise. Sometimes your mood is good, sometimes your mood is bad. But if you wait for one day and check your review, so your mood may change to the normal level, and you are less likely to suffer from the noise when you give it a second look, when you give a second chance, you look at your review, what you wrote yesterday. Maybe yesterday you are in a very bad mood, so you write a review that suffers from some bias or noise. But today you look at it again, then you may revise, you may kind of adjust some of your errors previously you made. I think that is a very good suggestion.
Tawfiq, last advice?
We can tackle one of the questions, the format, before we end this. A format should not be the role of the editor, the reviewer. You don't need to assess the format. Whether that's a reflection of low knowledge of the reviewer or not, that's another issue. But the format is not your responsibility as an author, as a reviewer. Last advice, I would say, reality is not only in one head. It's everyone has their own realities, and the instruments that they use are different. So the instruments that you use as a reviewer works for you to shed light or to open or understand the reality that you want to see. Those instruments might be different or might be different, and other people in this world see different realities because they use different instruments. So it's I think to move science forward, it's important to acknowledge those different instruments and different realities. So that's from a very high philosophical perspective on the review process.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all. And again, on behalf of the Middle East and North Africa chapter of the Association for Information Systems, the Saudi Association for Information Systems, and the Interdisciplinary Center for Finance and Digital Economy at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, I would like to thank our panelists, Professor Liangfei Qiu and Professor Tawfiq Alashoor, for their great insights and information about reviewing and how to conduct virtuous and constructive review. Thank you so much, all. Thank you for the audience for asking the questions and interacting with our panel. And hopefully we will see you in other events sponsored by all these 3 chapters and research centers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.